Right. We'll start. Welcome to this last afternoon session of the Prague Summit. The subject is EU energy security between business and politics. I'm Richard Cockett. I'm the business editor, brilliant business editor of The Economist magazine, based in a soon-to-be ex-member of the European Union. I've got a distinguished panel to discuss EU security. Starting on my left, Beata Jaczewska, who's a member of the high-level advisory panel to EU Research Commissioner on decarbonisation pathways for the EU. On my immediate left is Jan Kerner from General Electric, Head of Strategic Development. On my immediate right, Jaczewska, Ambassador at Large for Energy Security at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in the Czech Republic. And then last but not least, on my right, a Greek in Wales, Filippos Proedrou, who's a research fellow at the University of South Wales in Cardiff. So it's a big subject, EU energy security. You'll see some of the subjects we're going to discuss in the brochure. But I've also written down 4 subjects for myself as well, which I'm going to ask the panel to discuss later. And they seem to be some of the sort of major challenges to EU energy policy in the years ahead. So great strides have been made in terms of decarbonizations, emissions, but more still needs to be done. The first subject really is price. It is a fact that energy consumers in Europe pay twice as much for their electricity as consumers in America. So electricity, energy is still relatively expensive here, and that's probably going to be one of the real problems going forwards. It's a price we have to pay for investment in renewables, but what can be done about it? Are there other ways to lower the price? Before you have the sort of consumer and political revolutions that, for instance, we've just seen in Britain. I've just come from an election, you might have noticed last Thursday, where for the first time both parties, even the Free Market Conservative Party, were promising to cap energy prices. Labour was going to much further. They were promising to renationalise half of the energy industry. So this was a sign of a consumer revolution and a political revolution against high energy prices. The second major subject is vulnerability. Still 53% by the last count of Europe's energy comes from abroad, which leads you ineluctably into a discussion of Russia. Are we still too dependent on unreliable foreign sources for European energy? The third subject is that there's still, I think people would agree, too little coordination of European energy. Each country chooses its own. It's a sort of pick and mix menu of energy sources. Some, like Germany, go are entirely non-nuclear. Others, like France and Britain, are investing heavily in nuclear. Others, like Poland, want to increase perhaps coal to lessen dependence on other countries. And the fourth one is the geopolitics, which leads you again to China and Russia. We just had a panel here on European involvement in external actors. And again, is there too much dependence and how to reduce that dependence? And here, there are new developments in the Middle East, Africa, which we might discuss as well. But before getting into all that, I've asked each panelist to give a 3-minute summary of their views on this subject. I'll be very strict on the clock, but that's just to set up the discussion and for you to hear the major interests of where our panelists are at the moment thinking about this subject. And I've asked Jan to start. Jan.
Okay, good afternoon. We will be talking about energy security, and there are, as you showed in your introduction, there are many aspects of it. And when you first hear about energy security, you think about gas taps being closed and people freezing in their homes. But actually, it is much broader. Keeping the lights on and keeping the whole system working is a big part of energy security. And on its own, it's not as trivial as it seems, especially when Europe is pursuing many different objectives, not only energy security, but many environmental objectives. And of course, we all want low prices for consumers, but keeping wholesale prices, that's the prices that energy producers are being paid for what they produce, at the level that makes their business sustainable. And this means that we have to carefully balance our objectives within Europe and make sure that with all the technological advances, we make projects that are necessary for keeping the lights on and keeping our energy secure, making these investments attractive for energy companies, be it incumbent big utilities or upcoming small players which engage in distributed power generation or in innovative business models that help to reduce energy demands across the continent.
Great. Filippos, I think I was going to ask you second.
I think that the energy security discourse is plagued by what I would call traditional issues, and that we have to look very carefully at the developments that have been slowly but gradually taking place in the last decade in the European, but not exclusively at the European market. I'm talking about the new sources coming into the mix, but most importantly, new modes of production, like self-consumption, self-generation of solar and wind energy, new market players like aggregators, new business models emerging, the idea about prosumers markets, the gradual electrification of the sector, which also brings onto the fore the discussion about the decentralization of the electricity architecture. Those new issues and challenges go hand in hand with traditional ones: affordability, geopolitical linkages, insecurity, and it also is interplayed very, very seriously with other concerns, most importantly, sustainability. And by sustainability, I mean, first of all, mitigating climate change, which, according to the Paris Accord, even if we go on successfully with the national contributions, we are not going to have made it by 2030. So if the energy system is to achieve its three goals, meaning secure supply of energy at affordable, whatever that means, prices, because we also have extensive energy poverty in Europe, not to talk about other regions, and sustainability, meaning that we don't go on with runaway climate change, we have to try to balance those, something which is very, very difficult. My idea, which perhaps may be a bit radical, is that business as usual scenarios may keep the lights on, but will not manage to solve all our problems. This, of course, makes energy and climate policy and a more integrated picture much more hard to achieve. But I think that we can embark upon more ambitious policies, try to capitalize on the new developments, and try to look ahead at the challenges that they are presenting us with, and see for a new energy sector of the 2030s. And this means catering for the citizens, of course, but also catering for all the players that are invest in the market and see how they can continue making reasonable profits within the value chain. Because, first of all, it's the corporations that do feel the pressure. You know that a few insurance companies have stopped to insure fossil energy schemes because they deem them very, very insecure, because it is established business models and markets that are under pressure from renewable energy and so on. So we are going to make the transition to new markets. Let's see that we make the most out of them to achieve all our goals.
Thank you very much. Václav?
Okay, well, just a short, brief remark. We tend to live in digital times when we want to have things happen immediately, overnight. So energy is a boring, but also surprisingly resilient area where I can assure you that 10 years from now, we will discuss at similar conferences the same issues as we do today. Poland will still run on coal, France will still run on nuclear, we will still discuss climate change. In the same time, it's going to be confusing because under those semi-permanent structures, there are quite a few changes happening. I would say that two are fundamental, from my position. One is the new ways how to drill for oil and gas, the fracking in the US, which actually changed fundamentally the picture. If you are in the oil and gas business, that the US went from importer of natural gas and oil into being exporter in a single decade is actually unheard of. And the second thing is actually that more and more people talk about environment, not just in Berlin or London, but also in places like Beijing and New Delhi. That's actually a fundamental change as well. So we will probably find new technologies how to drill and how to find sources. We will also probably more and more care about the environment. But with all this in mind, 10 years from now, energy will look very much similar like it does today. 20, 30 years from now, it will still look very similar like today. Probably.
Okay, we'll test that at the Prague summit in 10 years' time. We'll come back to you. Beata, what's your thoughts?
Thank you, and good afternoon. From my perspective, I would start with saying that energy security is not a separated policy. It's just in a circle of a few other policy angles that complete each other and accelerate each other, or maybe have the potential of accelerating each other. And Filippos touched on this, proving this wider context. Let me just add that energy security policy is also not something that we have here in this region. It is a global issue. And mentioning the Paris Agreement and the climate negotiations, we tend to forget here in Europe that for many people all over the world, energy is treated like a human right because they are fighting for having any access to energy. And we are far away from this situation in Europe. We are talking about big business, we are talking about big threats, but in a global context, energy security means something different. That's my first point. Second point, again, the energy security is in the middle, in a circle of other policies. Innovation, absolutely. Environment, not as a threat, as a completion again. What's wrong with the environment policy if we are discussing how to most effectively produce energy, how to store energy, and how to use it also in an effective way? So these are the angles that we are still, I believe we haven't explored all of the possibilities that we have in Europe, because we are really coming from a developed, rich region. This part of the world is really coming with new good ideas, with new technical solutions, with new innovations. We are experienced with that. We just tend to limit ourselves, but by not seeing those opportunities. And one last point in the intro, from this perspective, we also do not listen to the society. That's my controversy to start the discussion, but I also believe that something that happened with the climate negotiations, with the greater involvement of the people, the narrative has changed and the political statements have changed, and at the end the political achievements were uptaken at a different level, the level that nobody would imagine years before. This is exactly the link that we are missing when discussing the energy security as such, because we are still treating energy security as a big state policy issue, with the sole role for the states to decide on this, not involving people who could at the end maybe agree on the higher prices of the energy, just knowing that this energy is coming from sustainable sources, or that this is our European investments in the global future.
Thank you very much, Beata. Thank you very much. So maybe we could start with discussing the first sort of item on my little hit list, price as a sort of general subject. I want to ask you all, I mean, is this something you should worry about? I mean, some people argue that it's making a European industry, for instance, very uncompetitive. More and more countries adopting, say, industrial strategies, of which energy controls are part of that. How have prices got so high? What are the main things we can do to bring them down? You've mentioned, that this is a series of trade-offs, but are those trade-offs the correct ones we're doing at the moment? What are the correct ones? Filippos, maybe I could start with you. You mentioned ambitious plans for future. Do you think about price control a lot and the affordability of
I would frame the situation differently. I think that as an EU and as individual member states, there is very, very little discretion and leverage to the formation of prices, which means that whenever a decade ago oil prices were at record highs, you couldn't do anything. Accordingly, gas prices with Russia, because they were tied to the oil price, were very high. Now we are going through a gas glut, which means that there is, to a great extent due to the shale gas revolution in the US, we have increased production, together with a slump in the global energy demand, see China. The numbers are working perfectly for the EU, so we have low prices, and most importantly, we have the possibility to bank on this surplus gas, because the Asian powers don't need so much gas as it's currently produced. So we're going through a nice period in terms of prices when it comes to imported oil and gas. But we have to think that we have no power over their future fluctuations, and experts already predict that by the beginning of the next decade, gas prices in particular will be on the increase again. The electricity sector is, I think, of great importance here, because we have seen an increase in electricity prices, but the last 2 years, some countries like Britain, well, we're talking about the EU, so I don't know, but Britain and Germany have seen also some reductions. And we have to see the cost of the bills and the cost in general. For example, when an LNG terminal is built for security reasons, it's not the consumers that pay directly. Okay, it's the taxpayers, not the consumers of electricity. But I think that there is another thing that is more important, the shale gas revolution. This experiment started in 1975 in the US, and it has been granted great support from the US federal budget as well. It only culminated 3 decades afterwards, and there are a lot of environmental burdens tied to that. The Chinese have invested heavily on renewables the last 5 years, and they have brought prices down remarkably, which means that we can't expect from renewable energy to be cheap and affordable like that. We have to put money on that, in the same way that we may put to fracking or everything. It's a matter of prioritization, but I think that if you see the big picture, there is a lot of merit in investing in an interconnected electricity system, and I can just enumerate very, very briefly a few of the reasons. First of all, it is energy that can be produced in different ways, by ourselves, bringing community energy, bringing self-generation, self-consumption. Belgium, for example, and Germany are very, very successful when it comes to that. This also lowers the vulnerability to exports, the Russia debate, and so on. Germany has done it. Poland has not done it that much. Czech Republic has not done it that much. Greece, which is very sunlit, has not done it that much. Which means that it really depends on how we visualize the whole project and how we try to bring benefits. We have smart grids, smart meters, other smart metering infrastructure. We have demand response management. We have an emerging prosumers market where you and me can produce energy, consume it, sell it. We can use all this equipment to save more energy, to be more efficient, and we can generate investments that are inward-looking. At this juncture, economically speaking, this is very, very important, because think that we are basically, the Europeans, subsidizing the Middle East, the Russians, with our money, okay? If we manage to verticalize our industries, or even get the equipment from abroad, but then be able to go on with that, we are generating more jobs in Europe, within Europe. The multiplier effect of this Monday respending is, I think, what is missing from Europe, where we have outsourced a lot of industry. Now, this will create problems when it comes to the entrenched companies. So we have to see, before going on with an abrupt change and looking at divestment and looking at bankruptcies, to see how they are involved in the dialogue and how we move smoothly, but also as quickly as we can, for all sorts of reasons.
Thank you, Filippos. Can I turn to you next? You might be an entrenched company at GE on Filippos' prospectus. How do you see this? I mean, you have to make money out of the European market.
When we talk about price, price reflects many decisions made throughout the years and reflect the overall efficiency of the system. Many decisions which were made not to push down the price, but to achieve our other objectives. And I think Europe should be proud for pushing ahead with renewables. However, on the other hand, this means that our power prices will include contributions to initial investment in renewable technologies. The feed-in tariffs paid for PV solar in Germany, in the Czech Republic, in many other countries, will be in the price for next 10, maybe even 15 years. On the other hand, the fact that the cost of some technologies went down will influence the future prices. So the takeaway here should be that we should be very careful about making decisions which affect the system for the years to come. And it may be policies, support schemes, but it is also decisions on diversification of fuel sources or decisions about suppression of certain technologies. And
in what sense should we be careful? What shouldn't we be doing?
We should be careful in terms of understanding the implications. We make some decisions, like when we talk about energy security. I think Europe has done a great job adjusting the systems since 2009. People look at Europe as a group of countries which are very slow in making decisions and achieving goals. If we look at these last 8 years and at the growth of infrastructure and introduction of reverse flows in transportation systems, I think it is a great achievement. But when we made those decisions, when we increased our energy security, sure, it has implications on gas prices if there are more pipelines and more sources of fuel. And the same applies to power production, inclusion of renewables, and in the future ensuring reserve capacity that will be needed for balancing the growing capacity of renewables.
Okay. Václav, what's your thing on this? I mean, do we need, you suggested coordination was still poor in Europe in terms of these. I mean, are you worried about price? Is price affordability, structure, is that something that you worry about in an official role? Or?
Not so much. I think you have to differentiate between those fuels which are irreplaceable as yet and those which are replaceable. So far we don't know what to do with oil and its derivatives. I mean, gasoline and diesel are still the prime movers, and the airlines, the cars, and the ships will still not move without that. On the other hand, natural gas is primarily here used for heating and for chemical production, so we can replace it if need be with some other fuels. It will be difficult, dirty, but you can survive a winter. And you should let your suppliers know that you can survive winter without their gas. It greatly helps in negotiations about prices. And I think you should go one by one. with our fuels and sources and the countries. Once you box yourself in the corner, when you say, well, I need this much gas from one certain country, then you're done. You basically are begging on your knees. If you say, well, I would like this much heat from these possible sources, and it could be Russia, Algeria, LNG, and others, it's a much better situation. So just being sensible, I think, makes sense. And final word, this is the richest continent and the richest and strongest economic power in the world still, and the biggest market by far, 500 million people. Even once you leave, it will still be pretty big. So let's use the power we have. I mean, natural gas, this country now for the last 10 years is part of the Western European gas market. We pay basically the German price or Dutch price for natural gas. Gazprom has to behave very much differently from how it behaves in countries, let's say, more to the east or south. Over here, there is nothing they can try.
Okay. Beata, your thoughts on this?
I have a problem with this question because this question is too simple, I would say. It's not so easy to say that this is that much depends on the energy price. Of course, much depends on the energy price, but you have to first define what is the energy price. It's the production, it's the transmission, it's there are lots of hidden parts of this price, and from the social point of view, I would always say that affordability is an issue, and affordability for the final customer is always an issue because it's really influences people's life. And I'm always giving the example about the cold winters in Poland, where really the heating is important to prevent people dying. But to reverse the example, it's more or less similar in the south of Europe in the summer. To prevent people from dying, you have to give them airco, otherwise it will be a problem. But those two examples bring me to the bigger picture. Europe is diversified in a sense of even the climate conditions all over. And what we need when thinking of the energy prices in the context of whether or not they are affordable for European citizens, maybe we need more of the European solidarity here. Technology is there. We have connectors, everything. We just cannot like jump one level higher from this thinking of the national energy systems into the European energy system, and maybe this is the challenge.
Yeah. Maybe that takes us into the next topic I wanted, which was vulnerability, energy security. Just briefly, Russia is mentioned as our topic. I mean, how you seem quite sanguine now about Europe as vis-à-vis Gazprom and Russia. Is that over? The shocks we had a couple of years ago about turning off the gas to Ukraine, etc., and then Europe supplies less thing. Europe's done a lot of work since then to become more self-reliant. Is that still a problem that we should worry about? Is there a lot more to be done?
I said Northwestern European gas market.
Yeah.
The countries which are connected, let's say, Northern France, Germany, Benelux, Britain, Denmark, us. And so, of course, it's a very different picture when you go more south or Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And in 2009, I had the pleasure to be the European point man in the gas negotiations. So like Putin, Sechin, Tymoshenko, Yushchenko. And it was very clear that all these people, both in Moscow and Kiev, knew very clearly who has other sources and who does not.
Yeah.
Bulgaria, no other supplier, so we can apply plenty of pressure. Over here, not so much. So I would say that's still, and that's actually another of those recurring topics. If you come to energy security conferences for a couple of years, you will hear about the need for interconnectors and unified European market because it's more robust and able to withstand the pressure from outside. And you hear about it all the time. Yet 25 years after the change in our part of Europe, most countries in Central Eastern Europe are not connected to the West. And there is, of course, it's on purpose. It's not a coincidence. It's because if you are running a country in Central Eastern Europe, and you are the one negotiating with Moscow about the gas price. Nice. We privatized the gas industry 15 years ago, fully. Now Czech politician goes to Moscow to negotiate for price, which is probably the reason why our politicians are mostly poor.
Okay, Filippos, what's your view on that?
I wouldn't worry that much about the European gas market, although we have to somehow fragment the picture. I mean, Central Europe, France, Germany are in a very good position. Southeastern Europe or Eastern Europe are not in such a good position. The European Commission, the liberalization project, the interconnectivity plans have actually yielded resilience to the market, which means that the EU can easily endure any crisis for a few weeks at least, or 1 month, contrary to what was the case 10 years ago. I think that it's more of a psychological issue. You think that you have entrusted your energy sector, which is vital for your economy and your politics, to Russia, and you don't like that. But Russia doesn't have that much leverage, and the more it uses it, the more it loses this card for the future. But we have to think that there is a lot more in the gas market. I mean, take Southeastern Europe. You have South Stream, you have geopolitics, you have international political relations that in most cases mask the gas imperative. You have, I saw the question about the Southern Corridor. You have the new discovery in Egypt and the idea of creating the East Med pipeline. The states try to see their geopolitical role within these projects and then the energy security rationale, because there is no reason for the EU to build now more pipelines in terms of gas. We have less gas demand, we have an oversupply, and we don't know if we are going to make the pipeline operative in 5 years, if we are going to need it, or fill the whole of it, or run costs then. And then if we do it, we may lock into infrastructure we may not be needing in 20 years. And the businesses need a big time scale for these pipelines. You know, the East Med pipeline is an excellent project for Greece. You don't have gas running through Turkey. Greece is elevated as a hub. Its role, it will get transit revenues. Yeah, great. But it will cost billions. It's a subsea route. I don't think that it can be supported, and this is why it has not moved forward. South Stream project, the same thing. Nord Stream, via the Black Sea, it's running at less than full capacity because of EU regulation, which means that all these projects are high-profile international projects that have much more to do with other issues, including energy. You saw, on the other hand, that you had the disputes with Ukraine. So what? There was necessity for gas. Gas is still flowing, despite great fallout between the EU and Russia, sanctions, the annexation of Crimea, because there is a lot of resilience in the technical part and in the business part. The Russians need it, the Europeans need it.
Yeah, and what's your view on this one?
Yeah, in today's world, where unpredictable things are happening, and last year was very rich in that. I wouldn't say that we shouldn't be worried about geopolitical turmoils and their potential consequences for our energy security. What I think is interesting is that the solution for this is the same as for the topic that we discussed before, for the price. Yeah, interdependence of European countries can help in solving both of these problems. If we have independent systems, if we each country rely on our own sources of energy, our own policy, the overall system will be less efficient and less resilient, and therefore more expensive and more dangerous. So I would say we should try to build interdependent systems where under normal conditions we have highly efficient power generation, transmission, distribution. We can balance renewable energy produced in Spain with that produced elsewhere. We can use hydropower as storage to compensate for nuclear or more intermittent renewables in other parts of the continent. And at the times when there is a crisis, this interconnected system with diversified sources of fuel, LNG terminals that can feed interconnected gas transmission lines, we will be more secure and more resilient.
Are you disappointed then to hear Václav saying that this is a pipe dream? And this sort of incarnated, this hits the bedrock of political interests in Europe, and national interests.
Yeah, there will always be national interests, but on a European level, we need to find solutions that can meet some of the national requirements. Yeah? We may have common goals. And in one, let's say, related to CO2 emissions. And in one country, the most efficient solution for CO2 emission reduction would be offshore wind farms. In another country, it may be much more efficient coal power plants, because that is the most efficient way of reducing CO2 emissions. And at European level, we should be open to admit both of these solutions.
Okay, Beata?
Exactly. This is what we should be doing. This is how we should complete our own energy resources with the security of the region as such, with the security of the European Union. But I think it's a dream. I mean, I'm always saying this, and I always know that this is a kind of daydreaming. I would say this way. I'm sure that we do not have too much of energy resources here in this continent. We simply do not, in a sense of the natural resources. So we are vulnerable always, in a sense of being dependent from the international trade in this respect. That's the one thing. Then on the edge of the European Union, we have a monopolist. And that's the other thing I know for sure, that each and every time you have a monopolist on the market, it's always a threat to the natural growth of this market. So these are the challenges. These are the challenges that the politicians of the member states are facing. And I clearly understand that it will probably always be this national angle forever, because the politicians, governments of the member states are facing the threat of the blackouts in front of their own citizens, and this is something that they have to manage. But again, I would say that I see solutions. Still, I see the solutions on the European level. Something that we Europeans were not courageous enough so far to develop. With all of the limitations that the politicians are having, it is still some potential really in the so-called European solidarity. So when we are bigger, when we are like the customer, like the one buying the fuels, when we are bigger, we are stronger, and this should be the principle that should be followed.
Okay, and that goes into I'm going to ask one more question now before going over to questions from the audience and from on the screen. But that gives me to another very topical point, which is the Paris climate talks. Now, America, of course, has just withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, and some argue that this leaves the EU as the prime mover in basically global climate movement and emissions reductions. I wonder whether you agree with that, and also does this present Europe with an opportunity here? If it can take the lead, perhaps in conjunction with China, as China obviously hopes, could this prod Europe into making these sort of bold and ambitious plans that you want to be more courageous? America is now isolating itself on this issue. EU has been in the forefront traditionally of emissions reductions. Is this a great opportunity, or do you think it'll make no difference at all, and America withdrawing, in fact, will wreck the whole agreement? Who'd like to take that first? Filippos, yeah.
Well, I would exchange the EU with China, pragmatically speaking. The EU's role is confined to single digits. China is close to 1/4 of carbon emissions, and the Chinese are doing a lot to reduce their emissions, which are critical for global emissions, mostly for regions of pressure for air pollution and so on, because the situation is dreadful there. You can literally not see within a few dozens of meters. Secondly, I don't think that the Trump decision for now, and this may sound heretical, will have much of an impact, because this decision will be fought at all levels. And most importantly, the US up to now didn't have a federal policy if you take out one or two centralized initiatives, but it's basically the states within the US that are driving climate change mitigation. Thirdly, the EU will not achieve its goals if Britain comes out within 2019. So the EU has to see how it will make up for its collective goals if beloved Britain is out.
Okay, thank you.
So we have our problems in our own homes.
Indeed. Václav.
Europe produces roughly 10% of global CO2 emissions. So I think our weight in this is roughly equal to that. China emits much more, US do much more. So, and our percentage is going down steadily. So we love to think a lot about ourselves, Europeans, how we teach the world. The world doesn't always want to be taught, and especially not from Europeans. So I would be more humble, probably, than you suggest.
But China, it's interesting, China has expressed a willingness to, at least rhetorically, to embrace emissions. Some of its achievements are quite impressive, aren't they? But they look a lot to Europe for the technology in order to do that. So surely there is an opportunity.
At the same time, China needs to keep industry going. I mean, they've shifted roughly 600 million people from countryside to cities in a decade. And they still have another 500 million people to move. And they need to keep production going. So, I mean, this is the number one issue for China, definitely. The water, air, and food quality will, of course, be the next. But first, just like here or in Britain in the 19th century, people first want to have jobs and want to make money. Then they worry about environment.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Europe has already done quite a lot in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, pushing down the cost of technology. Yeah? When the PV boom in Europe started, it was the German consumers paying for the development of the technologies which are now being produced in China. And I would not want to underplay the importance of the recent decisions. But I think renewables are getting to the stage when many of the technologies are more or less becoming self-supporting. And in many parts of the world, the businesses will take the lead because it will simply be profitable. And for even in Europe, for many households or for many businesses, it is profitable to introduce PV solar or all kinds of renewable technologies because they produce electricity under grid parity.
Okay, Beata? Just briefly.
I'm just thinking how to say that briefly, because this is not a topic that you can comment with one sentence. First, I do not understand President Trump's decision at all. At all. I just simply cannot imagine the rationale behind. That's the one thing.
Okay. I think you're with most people there.
Federal government, I mean, the decision of President Trump is the decision of the federal authorities. The states, the cities of the United States of America are in. This is how I see the reaction of the citizens. The climate negotiations, the Paris Agreement, the whole process that the world is in is much more about the development aid, much more about the development of the countries in the world than just simply the CO2 reduction. It's a bit wider, to be honest, and it is. Unfortunately, it is also very much linked to the technological race, to these competitiveness issues, to the investments of the business. And I wish myself to see in this process more of the human factor, and I believe that this human factor is growing, that it is, at the end, it is about saving the world for the future generations, that it's not so much cynical as it looks like. But I'm just afraid that this European reaction now would be a bit too bold, in the sense of I mean, I could imagine, this is something that I really can imagine, but this is something I know from the behind of the doors, that the European reaction would be that, okay, US is out, so let's be more ambitious. Let us be us who would save the world. Which is not so much economically justified, because economically this process is much more complex.
Yep.
I was the most brief I could.
Okay. Thank you very much, Beata. I'm going to turn to some of the questions now on the board, and then take some questions from the audience quickly. The most popular one is that one at the top. What are the options for reducing energy dependence upon Russia? Which I think we've heard something from already from the panel. But the other question, the other bit of it is, how do you evaluate the Southern Gas Corridor project, which is an interesting one. And the other one is, maybe the third one's interesting, with respect to EU energy security, has nuclear energy become obsolete? Obviously asked by a French person. Do you want to take the third one first, the energy, nuclear energy, because this is an energy source that is really splitting Europe. Germany doesn't do it at all anymore. France and Britain, for instance, are racing to build giant new nuclear reactors. Who wants to take nuclear? Yeah, Butler.
You're sitting in a country which generates roughly 1/3 of its electricity from nuclear power stations. So public support for nuclear is around 70%. So obviously we will not leave nuclear just because our neighbors are leaving it. I mean, that's fine with us. I mean, we are the second biggest exporter of electricity in the EU. Our two biggest export markets are Germany and Austria, and we're quite happy with that. I think Europe will remain split. Some countries will not do nuclear, some will remain, some will leave. Maybe others who don't do nuclear today will join one day. And I think the Brexit is actually fine with Europe.
And that's fine. Yeah. Filippos?
Yeah, I think that this opens a broader issue that I would like to underline anyway. The way we move forward as a European Union, and I mean member states here, is that it's path dependent with the past. So when member states have already proceeded with nuclear energy, it makes a lot of economic and environmental sense to go on with it. Because you have sunk the costs, it makes sense as long as the safeguards are in place. Okay? It's the safeguards for building new nuclear power plants that makes costs skyrocket. Do not let us forget that nuclear energy is renewable. There is just huge concern in case something goes wrong, as Japan showed us. But as long as nuclear energy is up and running, I think it helps very much climate policy, energy security. Okay? But we have to pay all our attention and, of course, pay some costs to ensure that no nuclear disaster breaks. And I think that this should be a springboard for the policy, for the energy policy of member states. You go on with what you have and you try to integrate this into your broader security climate goals. We can't expect that Poland, I think your point that in a decade we're still going to discuss the same issues, to an extent, I agree with it. For example, Poland will burn coal in 2025 as well. Other states perhaps would not, because they don't have such ample quantities, they don't have so much employment based on that. The big thing here is to try to generate energy security and the belief in energy security and climate security in the most effective way. And this calls for different approaches that will make up into an integrated one. So nuclear policy, as far as we follow the right procedures and everything, I think it's sound for the next decades.
Thank you, Filippos. Yeah, do you disagree with any of that?
No, I believe that we should not single out any technology. We should just apply common sense and define simple, measurable objectives, and then let the technologies compete, and the ones that are the best for a particular country to win and attract investment. Yeah? Nuclear energy is not cheap. Yeah? As we see at Hinkley Point, the support for the project will be huge and will be a big commitment for the taxpayer for decades to come. Yeah? Does it solve the problems that the UK energy system is facing? Somebody decided yes. Yeah? So I think applying common sense and applying simple, measurable criteria for the values that we want to pursue is the way to decide about technologies. To single out technologies on more or less ideological basis is not the right way to do it.
Thank you. Beata, do you agree with that? Singling out technologies on ideological grounds is not a good thing?
I would say that in the technology development, sky is the limit. And we Europeans, we prove it every day. And I really cannot imagine that nuclear would be the choice only because of the stability of the energy production. I much more believe in diversification of the energy sources. This is something that is just, I'm just a bit more convinced with this. Also with this angle of including the prosumers production with the small energy sources. And I would say that nuclear, yes, provided that's renewables as well.
Okay.
Because this is, even with the fossil fuel energy production, we have not explored all of the possibilities of applying new technologies, of making energy production more CO2 efficient and also economically efficient.
Okay, sorry, I think that's, got that. Right, we're going to go to the audience now for some questions. I'll take 2 or 3 and then ask the panel to pick what they want. Gentleman in the front in the white suit. Do we have a microphone for him?
I'm Edward Lucas from The Economist, and I used to be the energy editor. And I want to pick up, Václav made a very interesting point that it's going to be basically the same in 10 years or 20 years, and a lot of it's going to be similar. And I wonder if we are not underestimating the impact of technological change and how quickly the digital revolution is going to change things. We have increasing amounts of zero marginal cost power coming into the system. We've had that before with nuclear, but we're now having it in far greater quantities coming from wind and solar with zero marginal cost storage. And that produces all sorts of difficult problems for how do we attract investment into the non-zero marginal cost part of the system. We're also seeing a huge shift away from big centralized power providers towards the so-called prosumers, people who may be storing a bit of electricity, producing a bit of electricity, being able to modify their electricity consumption according to price signals. So the market is coming into play in the way in which we consume electricity as never before. And we also have this revolution in natural gas, which has only started, we should remember, only in North America, really. We haven't yet seen other countries getting into fracking in the same way. I would be interested to know if the panel thinks we should have fracking in Europe. I certainly think we do. If gas is going to get cheaper and cheaper, and electricity is getting cheaper and cheaper, and the system is becoming much more like the internet and much less like the sort of planned economy we've seen in the past.
Thanks, Edward.
It's going to be very different.
Two questions in there, I think. There's a gentleman at the back. Right, yeah, thanks.
Good evening, I'm Loïc Simonet from the OSCE in Vienna. If I may come back quickly to this EU-Russia energy interdependence, it seems to be a topic that journalists and think tankers love. And since 2006, there is hardly one winter when we feel the need to buy candles because we feel that the Russian gas will stop soon. But it seems to me that the reality is a bit different. First of all, Russia has been for 50 years, all in all, quite trustworthy. The flows never stopped. The flows of oil and gas never stopped, except shortly in 2006 and 2009 as a consequence of the Russia-Ukraine dispute. But here also it was for a short while, and there was more harm in the newspapers than in the daily life of the EU citizens. And second, it seems to me that Russia's market share is not about to decrease. Nord Stream is working at full capacity. Nord Stream 2 is about to be constructed, is about to be built. Turk Stream is also on the right tracks. So the EU will keep on relying on Russian supplies. It's a matter of fact. So my question to the panel is the following. Is there really a danger behind this energy interdependence between EU and Russia, or is it something exaggerated and overemphasized, sometimes for political reasons? And are we not losing our time focusing so much on that? It seems to me that our German friends, for example, feel perfectly comfortable in receiving gas through Nord Stream 2. So yeah, I would like to have the opinion of the panel on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And any other questions? We got a couple there, so I could go straight back to the panel. Any other? Yes, there's a hand going up there. Yeah, thank you.
This is a short comment to what Beata Jaczewska said. Thank you so much. My name is Leyla Aliva. Originally, I'm from Azerbaijan, but at the moment, I am affiliated with University of Oxford. I've been doing a lot of consulting to the oil companies, and I've been in the area of energy security for a long time. But what I appreciated most of all that you said about the human factor. In the energy security, 2 years ago, we published a paper on actor-centric approach, or let's say view from below, of what is the energy security of various actors, including societal actors, in our part of the world, because very often the inter-elite trade relationship in the energy area, they are asymmetrical. Because on the one side, on the Western side, EU side, there is a representative. On the other side, you don't have a representative government. So we need to know what the society is. So I would like just to attract your attention that it is a very important source of possible political conflict, total discrepancy in perception of what energy security is about on the side of the elite and societies in the country's suppliers. And after we published that paper, I later discovered that there was also, after us, the Kaunas University also published a paper on the role of society, democracy in the energy security. So there is accumulation already of the studies going from the east about how important to include the societal factor into reconceptualizing energy security. Thank you. That was just a comment.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to put these 3 or 4 questions to the panel, then they can, I think, pick one each if you like. First of all, probably one for Václav, are you underestimating the speed of technological change? Isn't that going to transform the market? That's one. Secondly, interesting one of fracking. Hadn't mentioned fracking. Should the EU frack? It's totally banned in France. Britain is trying to start, for instance. So again, widely divergent opinions on fracking. Are we exaggerating the the Russian threat or the Russian risk at the back there? And also one about societies and their involvement in sources. Václav, do you want to start off with the technological change? Are you underestimating or ignoring, indeed, the pace of technological change? Isn't that going to transform this?
Well, I'm just trying to base our assumptions on available technologies, not on promises. 10 years ago, if you would go to the, as you certainly did, go to energy conferences, everybody spoke about coal with CCS, coal with carbon capture storage. It was like the mantra. British Prime Minister spoke about it, everybody spoke about it. If you do mention carbon capture storage these days, it's like you did something inappropriate in the room. It's like you snore too heavily because it's like forbidden, it's a no-no, because it simply didn't work out.
Yeah, it didn't work out.
But you could see government plans from 2007 speaking, we will have 30% coal with CCS by 2030. So I'm cautious on this because when you talk to companies, any company, they will always push their products and say, we already have the technologies in place. You ask about batteries and you will find dozens of companies which will say, we have basically the batteries problem solved, it's just maybe a few more months and we're done. And you talk to them 3 years later and the problem is still there. So that's all I'm saying. Definitely there will be a change, we're already seeing that. It's just, it will probably be, especially for the big cities and big industries, you will need big sources of electricity, which will probably be the same ugly coal, something burning things a couple of decades from now. It will be fundamentally different probably for many small consumers because already, what you already mentioned, Jan, you have plenty of possibility for small houses or estates to go renewable already these days. You can basically become an island already. So I see difference between big cities and big industry and small cities. But I would always be urging for caution when you talk to companies about the best technology they already have and they just need a couple $1 billion or euros or crowns from the government to finish the product and then it will be the thing to do.
Okay, thank you, Václav. Who wants to tackle fracking? It transformed the American market, as we said. Can fracking transform Europe in a similar way? Jan, do you want to take that on?
I would like to link it to the previous topic because for me fracking is also technology. Yeah? And I already said that we shouldn't single out any technology, including fracking, based on irrational ideological grounds. Yeah? So I think Europe should provide environment for businesses to develop shale gas. The conditions should be reflecting the values that we have in this region, should provide chance to business to develop shale gas in economical way. Yeah? The conditions definitely will be different from the US. They are physically, the conditions are different. There are different land or resource rights in Europe. But if we simply ban it in some part of the world, I don't think it's the best solution. Linking shale gas to technological development, I think we are probably underestimating the the possibilities. Sure, there are examples like CCS, which did not get off the ground, but it did not get off the ground because of the technology. It didn't get off the ground because the collapse of EU ETS. Yeah? If CO2, ton of CO2 was not 6-7 euros, but 45, maybe it would work better. But I think there are technologies that we don't see at the moment. We are just starting to use the power of interconnectivity, predictability in industries, and I think these technologies can change the industrial world the same way they changed the retail world.
Okay, thanks, Jan. And very briefly, because we've overrun our time, are we exaggerating the risk from Russia?
Can I pick up on the previous ones?
No, we can't, because we're out of time. Just do the Russia one quickly.
As I said, it's not something objective out there in the world. It's a matter of perception. Tell the Polish that the Russians are not threatening them with their gas. It's hard. Tell the Greeks they don't mind that much, although they understand that there is only one route. Tell the Germans or the French, they see it somewhere differently. You don't have one threat, you don't have one perception of threat. Think that Poland also tried to create a NATO clause on energy security. Germany was obviously indifferent. So we can't put the issue like that. I think that it's not much of a threat, although because it's so vital, we have to shed light on it.
Okay, Beata, do you want to have a word on any of those quickly?
I have to.
Okay.
I would say this way to answer gentleman's concerns. If we really have the situation in Moscow that this is a market decision of Gazprom, as we see similar to our companies producing energy, I would believe that the threat as such does not exist. And that would be my diplomatic answer to your question. One more philosophical sentence, please. We have to be brave and bold in Europe in searching for new technologies. But ideology first, really, not to burn the planet, please.
That's a good way to end the session. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.